You were never supposed to hear this. What I'm about to tell you, most men will live and die, never knowing. Because when history writes its stories, it edits out the blood, the screams, the things that reveal the true cost of power. But not this time. Picture this for a moment. A hill bathed in sunlight, golden grass, rippling under a California sky. A place that now sells postcards of sunsets, where hikers sip lattes and take selfies at the observatory. Griffith Park. You've seen it in movies, maybe even walked its trails. Now imagine standing there on October the 3rd, 1933. The air so dry it cracks your lips. The wind cutting like glass. And somewhere beyond the ridge, you smell it. Smoke. Not a campfire, not a barbecue. Something darker. The kind of smoke that tastes like iron when it hits the back of your throat. 3,500 men. Hungry, desperate, broken. Scattered across those hills with picks and shovels in their hands. Men who came for salvation and found slaughter. They didn't know it yet, but in a few hours this park would become a crematorium without walls. Here's what no one told you. They weren't just victims of fire. They were victims of something colder. A decision. A calculation made in back rooms where names don't matter and numbers do. These men were sent into those hills for $1 a day. A single green bill to trade sweat for survival. But what they really traded was their lives. Because when the spark came, and it always does, the system didn't protect them. It didn't even care. There were no hoses, no escape plans, no radios to call for help. Just the order every poor man has heard since the dawn of industry. Work or starve. And when the flames rose higher than church steeples, when the sky turned black and the earth itself seemed to scream, that order didn't change. It only sharp. Ened, fight the fire or don't bother coming back tomorrow. This is the story they buried beneath the ashes. The fire they called an accident. The massacre they wrote out of memory. But tonight you're going to hear it all. The year was 1933. America was drowning in misery. Men weren't men anymore. They were ghosts, standing in bread lines for hours, clutching tickets for a meal that might never come, watching their children waste away in silence. Los Angeles was no exception. Behind the Hollywood glamour, behind the movie palaces and bright marquees, there was hunger, there was rot. Families slept in cardboard shacks by the river. Men fought over scraps of garbage like wild dogs. The city had a solution, or so they claimed. They called it a public works project. Beautify Griffith Park. Plant trees, build trails, shape the hills into something the rich could enjoy on their Sunday strolls. And for the broken men clawing for survival, it sounded like a miracle. $1 a day. That's all it paid. One single green bill for 10 hours of backbreaking labor under a sun that burned like a furnace. And so they came. Mexican laborers fleeing a revolution that chewed up everything they loved. Dust Bowl farmers who had watched their land turn to sand and blow away. College graduates who once wore suits and now wore rags. Men who had once been proud, reduced to shadows of themselves. Griffith Park became a sea of despair. 3,500 men scattered across the hills, swinging picks, hauling dirt, choking on dust that clung to their skin like disease. Under the eyes of supervisors who didn't see men, they saw numbers, quotas, bodies to be used up and thrown away. And still, those men worked. Because hunger doesn't wait for mercy. because $1 meant the difference between a child eating or going to bed with a stomach full of nothing. But what they didn't know was that this park was a trap, a death sentence disguised as salvation, because nature doesn't forgive arrogance. And the city didn't care enough to prepare. No hoses. Griffith Park in October is a desert wearing a mask. The hills look calm, golden, harmless. But that calm is a lie. The grass is brittle, snapping under your boots. The air sharp with heat. Every tree a torch waiting for breath. That morning the sun rose like a blade, cutting through the sky. By noon the temperature climbed past 100. The Santa Ana winds screamed down from the mountains, hot and relentless, a wind that doesn't whisper. It howls, whipping dust into the eyes of men, turning sweat into rivers that burned down their spines. The supervisors saw it. They smelled it. Every man in those hills knew this heat could kill. Fire in these ridges wasn't a risk. It was a certainty. But safety costs money. And money was for politics, not for poor men. So there were no hoses, no water tanks, no radios to call for help, only shovels, picks, and blind orders shouted by men in clean shoes. When workers asked for better tools, when they begged for water lines, they got the same cold answer. Be grateful you have a job at all. The truth is, this wasn't a job site. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And on that October day, that spark came. No one knows exactly how it started. Some say a cigarette tossed in the brush. Others blame a spark from a steel tool striking stone. But the truth doesn't matter, because the wind was hungry, and the hills were dry, and the moment that first wisp of smoke curled upward, history changed forever. At first it was nothing, a gray thread drifting through the grass, the kind of thing you could stamp out with a boot. But the Santa Ana winds at first the fire looked small, something you could beat back with a shovel. A job, nothing more. That's what the foreman told them. Handle it. Don't panic. And so the men ran toward the smoke. Not away from it. Toward it. Because they were ordered to. Because their pay, their pride, their hope was chained to obedience. They clawed at the earth, throwing dirt on flames with bare hands, swinging picks like madmen, digging trenches that the fire leapt over like a demon with wings. The wind fed the beast. Every gust turned sparks into firestorms. Every second the inferno grew louder, hungrier. A living thing with one purpose: to consume. Men shouted for hoses, for water, for help. The answer was a hammer blow to the soul. Fight it, or you don't get paid. Fight it, or don't come back tomorrow. So they fought, with rags, with hats, with their own bodies pressed into the dirt, trying to smother a monster that only laughed. Smoke poured into their lungs, thick, black, clawing at their throats until they coughed blood. The heat peeled their skin like paper. The air turned sharp enough to cut. And still the foreman screamed, "Get back to work. Get back in there." As if this was just another day on the job. Some men froze. Some men dropped their tools and ran. But there was nowhere to run. The fire was moving faster than horses. The hills were a maze of dead-end trails. Every escape route slammed shut by walls of fire that roared like hell itself. The truth hit them like a fist. This wasn't a fire to fight. This was a fire to survive. And survival meant breaking every rule. The first screams tore through the smoke. High, broken, animal sounds. Not words anymore, just raw terror. Men were burning, skin bubbling, clothes melting into flesh. Some tried to roll in the dirt, but the dirt itself was hot. It clung to their skin like fire ash. Panic spread faster than the flames. Orders collapsed. The foremen were shouting, but no one listened. Voices drowned in the roar of the wind. The fire was everywhere. Behind them, ahead of them, walls of orange closing in like a cage. Men dropped their tools, fought each other for escape routes. Some shoved, some swung fists, others ripped clothes off the burning. But there was no saving them. You could smother the flames, but not the scream. And those screams never stopped. Some men ran for the ridge, thinking they could outrun the inferno. But the fire ran faster. It leapt ridgelines like they weren't even there. It moved like thought, like rage with wings, and the wind gave it everything, driving it forward like a war drum in the sky. The smartest ones, the ones who had seen death before, they dropped to the ground. They dug shallow holes, buried their faces in dirt, praying the fire would jump over them, praying the heat wouldn't cook them alive. Some lived, most didn't. Then came the sound, that deep, thunderous roar. Not the fire, something worse. The hillside itself collapsing. The fire had eaten the roots, and the mountain came down. A landslide of rock and burning trees, crushing men like insects. Screams cut off mid-breath, smoke swallowing their last sound. By now, the fire was no longer a blaze. It was a storm, a living storm that tore the world apart. The fire wasn't just burning flesh. It was burning reason, burning the thin thread that held men human. They had two choices now: run into the flames, or do something worse, something that would haunt them forever. Some men ripped the shirts off the dying, soaked them in mud, wrapped them around their own faces, leaving the burned to choke and scream. Because there was no time, no mercy, only survival. Others dragged bodies, dead or alive, and used them as shields, pressing them against the fire to block the heat, praying the smell of charred flesh wouldn't break their minds, praying no one would see. But everyone saw, and no one cared. A few men found a wagon, loaded with tools. They tipped it over, hid behind it as the flames roared past. The wood burst into fire in seconds. The men behind it roasted like meat on a spit. One group hacked at a horse, split its belly open, crawled inside the steaming carcass. While it was still kicking, they thought the wet guts would shield them. And for a while, it did. Until the heat baked it like an oven, and they cooked alive inside their hiding place. This was no longer a fire. It was judgment. It stripped away every law, every illusion. Every man was alone now. Alone in the furnace, doing whatever it took to see the next breath, even if it meant becoming something less than human. Above them, the sky was gone, a black ceiling glowing red at the edges. And in that hell, men started whispering prayers, prayers to gods they had never believed in, prayers to devils they had always feared, because in the fire, both felt real. The exits were gone. Every trail they knew, burned out. Every ridge they trusted, on fire. The men were trapped in a circle of flame. Like animals in a slaughter pen, they ran toward the canyon, the only place left. A dry gulch cutting deep into the earth. It looked safe. It looked like escape, but it wasn't. It was a grave, a funnel for fire, a death chute carved by nature itself. Dozens of men poured into it, sliding down the rocks, choking on ash, their lungs scraping raw with every breath. The canyon walls rose high, too steep to climb, too slick with smoke and sweat, and the fire followed them, pouring down like a river of hell. The wind shifted again, a monstrous gust. It drove the flames into the gulch like a blowtorch. The air exploded. Men's clothes ignited just from breathing. The oxygen vanished. The heat sucked it out in seconds. Men fell, gasping, clawing at the dirt, their throats black with soot. Some tried to dig, fingers tearing at stone, desperate to bury themselves alive. But the fire moved faster than hands. It roared down the gulch like a predator, and the canyon became an oven, cooking everything inside. One man was seen standing, just standing in the middle, arms spread, screaming into the inferno, like he was daring it to take him. It did. In less than a heartbeat, he was gone. Nothing left but a black shape writhing in the dirt. And in that moment, the survivors knew the truth. There was no safe place, no way out. The fire was God now, and God was angry. When the fire moved on, the canyon was silent. No wind, no birds, no life. Only smoke curling from the ground like breath from a dying world. The men who had entered that gulch were gone, not burned, erased. Bones blackened and brittle, flesh fused to stone, faces twisted in shapes that no human mouth should ever make, some still clutching at the earth, as if digging in death, as if refusing to let go. Boots melted into feet, belts welded to spines, rings fused into bone. You couldn't tell man from metal. All of it blended into the same grotesque sculpture, a shrine to agony. The stench hung heavy, like the inside of a crematorium, but worse, because this wasn't just the smell of death. It was the smell of fear. Fear cooked into the very meat. Fear that would linger in the dirt for decades. The ground shimmered, so hot that even hours later, it could blister skin. Animals circled the edges. Coyotes, vultures, drawn to the scent. But they didn't enter. Even beasts knew this was no place for the living. One firefighter, barely alive, crawled out, his skin hanging in sheets. His eyes burned white. He whispered one word, again and again. Hell. Over and over, until his voice broke. And then, nothing. When news reached Los Angeles, the city froze. Fire had touched Griffith Park before, but never like this. Never with so many dead, so many burned alive in plain sight. Officials rushed to the scene. Reporters followed. But what they found was worse than words could carry. Rows of blackened bodies. Men curled like charred paper. Faces locked in screams. The kind of horror ink could never capture. They counted the dead. At first, 20, then 30, then 50. The number kept rising. Because in some cases, there was nothing left but bones, and in others, nothing at all. Just a scorch mark where a man had stood. The city wanted answers. How could this happen? Who sent those men up there? Why were they untrained? Why were they given nothing but shovels and picks? When the fire was a beast, a living thing no hand tool could kill. Questions burned hotter than the flames, and whispers began. Whispers that this wasn't an accident, that the men were sent to die, to clear land, to protect the wealthy estates that skirted the park. Lives traded for property lines, for money, for control. But officials shut it down. Fast. They called it a tragedy, a freak of nature. Filed their reports, stamped them with silence, and buried the truth under bureaucracy. The papers printed a neat story. Park Fire claims dozens. And the city moved on. But the families didn't. They wanted the truth. In the weeks after the fire, the grief turned to rage. Fathers, brothers, sons, gone in smoke, and the city offered nothing but condolences and a handful of dollars for burial. But behind closed doors, men in suits celebrated, because while bodies cooled in shallow graves, deals were heating up. Land near Griffith Park, suddenly clear of brush, suddenly perfect for development. Whispers started in the bars. The unions knew. The men had been sent without orders. No proper training, no escape routes. It was as if someone wanted them dead, as if the fire was a weapon, not a disaster. Rumors spread like sparks that the city wanted to clear squatters, that developers wanted the land for new roads, that the fire wasn't just fire, it was policy, it was profit, but no one could prove it, because every report, every testimony was sealed tight, and the men who signed the orders vanished behind their desks, untouchable, invisible. Yet something didn't add up. The call that sent hundreds of men into the canyon. Who made it? Why did they push them deeper? When they knew the wind had turned, when they knew the canyon was a trap, it was a massacre, disguised as misfortune. And the more the families asked, the more doors slammed shut, until they stopped asking, because the silence spoke louder than truth. And somewhere, in the ashes of Griffith Park, lay the evidence, buried under time, waiting to be found. When the fire died, the voices didn't. Stories leaked from the survivors, the few who crawled out, burned, broken. But breathing, one man, face blackened with soot, told the papers. They told us to dig, said we could stop it. But the fire, it was already here. Already on us. Another swore. He heard the foreman laugh, right before the wind shifted, right before the canyon lit up, as if someone knew this was coming. Then there were the journals. Charred pages pulled from the rubble, scrawled in pencil, half-burned words, but clear enough to chill the blood. Too hot, no way out. They told us to keep digging. We're not going to make it. These weren't soldiers. They weren't heroes. They were men with families, hired by the city for a day's pay, men who thought they'd be home by supper, and instead, they were fed to the fire. One page, singed and brittle, read like a confession. Feels wrong, like we're being used, like they want this to happen. And then, nothing. The ink trails off. As if the flames swallowed the rest, reporters tried to follow the trail. But the trail burned too. Files missing, names blacked out, an official story polished clean, and the truth left in the ashes. But some of those ashes still whisper, and if you listen close, you can almost hear it. The screams, the shovels hitting dirt, the wind roaring like a beast, right before it all turned to smoke. The investigation was a play, and the city wrote every line. On paper, it looked thorough. Interviews, hearings, pages of testimony. But when you dig deeper, you see the seams, questions that never got asked, witnesses who never showed, and a verdict that sounded rehearsed. The official report called it an act of nature, unpredictable, unstoppable. But the men who died didn't die from nature. They died from orders. Orders that sent them into the canyon. Orders that ignored the wind. Orders that promised control when the fire was already a monster. And who gave those orders? The names were redacted, buried under bureaucracy, locked in city archives. 100 signatures, and not one face held accountable. Families demanded answers. But every door they knocked on closed with the same excuse. It was an accident. Those words became a wall, and that wall never cracked. But some said the fire was perfect, perfect for clearing land, perfect for pushing out the poor, perfect for developers with deep pockets. Because weeks after the ashes cooled, deals started flowing, contracts signed, and new projects broke ground. Griffith Park didn't just burn, it was reborn. But not for the men who died there. Not for their families, for someone else, someone who walked away richer. And as the city moved on, the whispers never did. People knew, they always know. When blood is traded for progress, when a fire doesn't just happen, it's made. The signs were there, signs that this wasn't just fire. It was something else, something planned. Start with the dispatch records. Gone. The calls from the canyon that day, erased, as if no one begged for help, as if no one screamed down the line, while the flames ate everything. Then the witness list, shorter every week. Men who swore they'd testify, suddenly silent, or gone. One moved out of state. Another vanished overnight. No forwarding address, no trace. Reporters caught wind of it. But every lead, every source, collapsed like burned timber, under pressure, under threat, or worse, under bribes. And what about the tools? The shovels left at the ridge, bent, blackened, some of them stuck in soil so dry, it didn't even look like it had burned, almost like they were digging for something else. The coroner's notes were odd, too. Burn patterns that didn't match the wind. Bodies in clusters, like they didn't run, like they were caught, held, or trapped. But the strangest thing, the fire line maps, dozens of them, found in a city office years later, every map marked in red ink and circled in the margins. The same 3 words, clear the ridge. Who wrote that, and why? No one ever found out, because every time someone asked, the answer was the same. That page is missing. When the smoke cleared, the rumors began, and they spread like fire, through the bars, through the union halls, through every whispering corner of Los Angeles. They said the blaze wasn't an accident. They said it was a purge, a cleansing of land, for a city that wanted to grow fast, and didn't care who burned to make it happen. Theories piled up. Some claimed the park was standing in the way of a massive development deal, hotels, golf courses, luxury retreats for the rich. They needed that ridge, and the men on it were in the way. Others swore it was political, that someone wanted a headline, a distraction, or leverage against City Hall, and a fire this big, this bloody, would own the front page for weeks. And then there were the darkest whispers, that this was about control. The Depression had left the city bleeding, thousands of men jobless, desperate. What better way to remind them who holds the power than by sending them to the flames, with no pay, no protection, and no way back, because after that fire, nobody questioned the city again. Nobody marched for work. Nobody demanded more. They were too busy burying their dead, too busy fearing the next call to the ridge. Was it true? Was it paranoia? Or was it both? History won't answer you. But the land still knows. And if you walk that ridge at night, some say you can still hear them, the voices of men who burned for progress. The fire killed 29 men, injured over 150, and the city called it a tragedy, a terrible accident. But what they did next was no accident at all. While families grieved, City Hall moved fast. They seized the headlines, framed the story, painted the dead as heroes, men who gave their lives for the park, not men who were sent unarmed into an inferno. The mayor stood before cameras, tears in his voice, and promised reform, promised safety, promised jobs. And the people believed him. They always do when the blood is still fresh. Then came the land deals, silent, swift. Millions poured into projects to protect the park, new roads, new contracts, awarded to friends of the council, awarded to men who drank in the same bars, men who toasted the dead. With glasses full of profit, politicians climbed the ladder on those ashes. Campaigns were built on their bones. Never again, they said, as they pocketed the money, as they drew up plans for the next development. Because in this city, disaster is currency, and the fire paid out like a jackpot. And those who asked too many questions, those who wanted to dig deeper, they were told the same thing. Move on, for the good of the city, for the good of progress, for the good of Los Angeles. The city wrote its story, but the men who survived, they carried a different truth, a truth that burned hotter than the flames. They said there were no orders to stop, no retreat, no water, just shouting, keep digging. Even as the fire rolled down like a living thing, they said the bosses vanished, that when the smoke got thick, the men in charge were nowhere to be found. Survivors spoke in whispers. At first, around kitchen tables, over cheap whiskey in back rooms, because they knew what it meant to go against the city. It meant no work. It meant no bread for their families. But some couldn't hold it in. Some stood before reporters, told them the fire was a setup, told them they were sent to die, told them the city didn't care. And those men became ghosts in their own lives. They lost their jobs, lost their homes. One man turned up dead in the river. The paper called it suicide. Another just disappeared, vanished like smoke on the ridge. The others learned fast. Silence was survival. And so the truth stayed buried under contracts, under headlines, under time, until the men who knew were gone, and the city stood clean, as if none of it ever happened. But the land remembers, and the scars on that ridge are older than the trees that grew back. They called it an accident, a tragedy of nature, a gust of wind, a spark on dry brush. That's what the papers said. That's what the city wanted you to believe. But the survivors, the men who dug their own graves that day, they told a different story. They spoke of strange orders, orders that didn't make sense, orders to keep working as the fire closed in. Orders to dig, not to run, not to fight, just dig, until the flames swallowed the ridge. And then there was the timing. The fire came just weeks before a massive vote, a vote to fund city improvements, a vote that meant millions in contracts. And guess what? The bond passed after the fire, passed with ease, because nothing sells like fear. Nothing opens wallets like smoke on the horizon. Some said the fire started near a road crew camp, a crew that left early, before the blaze began. Some said they saw men in suits on the ridge that morning, men who didn't belong there, men with papers and maps and quiet voices. Coincidence, they called it. But Los Angeles was built on coincidences. Coincidences that always seemed to make someone rich. Was the fire nature's fury, or man's design? A match struck to ignite more than trees. A match to ignite power, because in this city, the fastest way to build is to burn. When the smoke cleared, the questions began. How did a small spark turn into a massacre? Why were so many men sent into a death trap? And who gave the orders? The city promised an investigation. The papers promised answers. But what followed was silence. Cold, calm, calculated. Silence. The coroner's inquest lasted only a few days. No cross-examination. No real witnesses. Just statements read into the record, most of them from city officials. The same men who stood to gain the most. The verdict. Accidental death. 2 words to erase 30 lives. 2 words to close the case forever. And the families. The widows. The mothers. They tried to fight. They begged for justice. They begged for truth. But every lawyer turned them away. Every judge refused their plea. Because the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Meanwhile, the city collected its insurance money. The contractors lined their pockets. And the park began to change. Roads, resorts, private concessions. All built on land that once burned. All built on ashes that once had names. The newspapers printed their final headline, "City recovers from tragedy." But the truth was buried deeper than the men in those shallow graves. And here's the darkest part. That fire was not the last. Not by a long shot. Los Angeles learned something from the Griffith Park Fire. Fire was power. Fire could shape a city. Fire could erase. And fire could create. After 1933, Griffith Park burned again. And again. And every time, the flames cleared space for progress. Or at least, that's what the headlines said. In the 1960s, another blaze swept through the hills. It destroyed homes, cleared land, and guess what followed? New roads, new housing projects, new developments for the wealthy. Some called it bad luck, a curse on the city. But the pattern was too perfect, too precise, too profitable. Every fire meant new construction contracts. Every blaze meant real estate deals. Every acre of blackened earth was a blank check. And the same names kept appearing, the same corporations, the same political donors, the same men who smiled at ribbon cuttings, while the ashes were still warm. To this day, Griffith Park remains one of the most fire-prone areas in Los Angeles. But here's the question no one asks. Is it nature? Or is it design? Is it bad luck? Or good business? Because when a city builds its fortune on fire, the flames never really die. They wait for the next deal, for the next contract, for the next spark. For the men who lived, the fire never ended. It stayed in their lungs, in their dreams, in the sound of wind through dry grass. Survivors spoke of shadows, men screaming, skin burning, voices begging for water. Even years later, they woke up choking on phantom smoke. Some never returned to work. They couldn't. Every spark looked like a killer. Every sunrise felt like a death sentence. And then there was the guilt. Why did they live? When their friends didn't, why did they run? When others burned? One man wrote in his diary, "I see them every night, calling my name, asking why I left them." Another survivor stopped speaking altogether. He disappeared into the desert. People said he went mad. Others said he knew something the city didn't want out. Rumors spread that some men had seen barrels in the hills, that there was oil beneath Griffith Park, that the fire was a cover-up. But those stories, those men, they vanished. Because back then, accidents were easy to explain, and silence was cheap to buy. But trauma doesn't stay buried. It bleeds. Through generations, through whispers, through the land itself. Even now, walk the trails at night, and you'll hear it. The crackle, the screams, the ghosts of men who burned for a city that forgot them. So what really caused the fire? Was it an accident, or was it something darker? The official report said dry brush, sparks, and bad luck. But that answer never satisfied the men who were there. Too many things didn't add up. The wind wasn't strong that day. The tools weren't the problem. And the blaze spread too fast, like it had help Some whispered about oil barrels hidden in the hills. Others said it was dynamite. A controlled burn gone wrong, or gone right, depending on who you ask. And then there's the land deals. After the fire, developers swooped in like vultures, buying scorched earth for pennies, and building mansions on top of graves. The city called it progress. But progress for who? Not for the men buried in shallow plots, not for the families who never got a dime, but for the ones who signed the contracts and toasted the flames. The newspapers moved on. The headlines faded, but the pattern didn't. Fire became a tool, a weapon, a business strategy. Griffith Park wasn't the last fire. It was the first in a chain. Each blaze feeding the same machine, the same names, the same money, the same hunger. The truth is simple. If a city can profit from destruction, destruction will come. And in Los Angeles, fire became the language of power. Griffith Park still burns. Not every day, but every decade. Like clockwork. The hills ignite, the smoke rises, and the cycle begins again. Today, they blame hikers, campfires, climate change, but follow the money. It always leads back to the same hunger: land, development, control. After every fire, something changes. A law gets passed. A contract gets signed. A new project rises where ashes once lay. Insurance companies cash in. Developers buy cheap. Politicians smile for cameras, while entire neighborhoods vanish, reduced to rubble, sold to the highest bidder. And Griffith Park, it stands like a monument to a truth nobody wants to say out loud. That fire isn't just a disaster. It's a business model. And the ghosts of 1933, they know it. They watch from the ridges, from the blackened earth. They whisper in the wind every time the hills start to glow. They know the city never learned, because it never wanted to. Even now, you can stand at the edge of the park, look across the dry brush, and feel it. The heat that never left, the greed that never burned away. And if you listen closely, you'll hear a question in the crackle of the leaves. How much is one life worth when an empire can be built from ashes? They call it cursed, Griffith Park, a place where deals are made in daylight, and shadows collect the dead at night. Ask the rangers. They'll tell you stories of footsteps in burned-out canyons, of voices calling from the smoke, voices that shouldn't exist. Some say the men who burned in 33 never left. They wander the ridges, faces blackened, eyes glowing like coals, searching for someone to blame. or someone to join them. Others whisper about strange accidents. Workers crushed under falling rocks. Hikers disappearing. Fires starting without warning. Like the park itself is alive. And angry. Old newspapers called it tragedy. Locals call it payback. Because Griffith Park wasn't just a park. It was bought in blood. Paid for in flames. And every ember remembers. The developers thought they could tame it. The city thought it could own it. But you can't own a curse. You can only feed it. And for almost a century, the city has been feeding. So when the next fire comes, when the smoke rolls down from the hills, and the sky turns orange, remember this. It's not just nature. It's history. It's a hunger. And it's never full. Griffith Park wasn't just a fire. It was a lesson, a blueprint. After 1933, the city learned something powerful. That destruction can be profitable. That fire can erase problems and create opportunity. From the ashes of Griffith Park came new roads, new contracts, new deals, signed behind doors the public never saw. And this wasn't just Los Angeles. It became a model, a dark playbook, used in Malibu, used in the hills, used wherever land was worth more than lives. The rule was simple. When nature burns, money grows. And if nature doesn't burn fast enough, well, sometimes it gets a little help. You think that's conspiracy. Look at the records. After every major fire, someone gets rich. Not the victims, not the workers, but the ones holding the deeds, the ones signing the permits, the ones smiling for the cameras while the smoke still rises. The Griffith Park Fire wasn't the last tragedy. It was the first strategy. And that strategy still rules California today. Every spark you see, every inferno on the news. Ask yourself, who benefits? Who gains? And you'll see the truth, glowing hotter than the flames. Decades passed, but the fire never really ended. It just changed its name. 1961. Bel Air burns. Homes worth millions reduced to ash. Developers swoop in. Rebuild bigger, richer, stronger. 1993. Malibu goes up in flames. Celebrities lose mansions. Insurance pays out fortunes. And once again, the hills become a gold mine. 2018. The campfire. Paradise erased. One of the deadliest fires in U.S. history. And behind the smoke, power companies, real estate sharks, investors circling like vultures. Because ashes make the soil cheap, and cheap land makes men rich. People cry on television. Politicians promise answers. But every promise is gasoline. Every law, every contract, keeps the cycle burning. They blame nature. They blame drought. They blame climate change. But nobody blames the men in suits, the ones holding pens like torches. The same dark truth born in 1933, still crawling through the flames today. That fire isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's an agenda. And Griffith Park was the spark. Some call it a curse. Others call it control. But either way, Griffith Park has never been just a park. They say the land was cursed long before 1933, back when it belonged to a rancher, Antonio Feliz, a man betrayed by those closest to him. As he lay dying, he spat out a warning that this land would bring death and ruin to anyone who claimed it. Decades later, the prophecy lived on. Fires, deaths, accidents. Every time someone tried to profit from Griffith Park, something burned or someone died. But curses are good stories, convenient myths. They distract you from the real curse, the humankind, greed, power, the hunger to control land at any cost. Griffith Park wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by men with ambitions, men who saw flames not as disasters, but as opportunity. So was it fate? Was it a curse? Or was it something much colder? Something calculated? Because when you peel back the smoke, the pattern is clear. Disaster creates wealth, and nothing feeds that system better than fire. And the men who profit from flames, they don't fear curses, they create them. Today, families walk the trails of Griffith Park. They ride the merry-go-round. They picnic under the trees. And they never know. They're standing on the ashes of men. They look at the Hollywood sign. They take their photos. And they never ask. What was burned? What was buried? What was stolen? To make this dream possible. Because fire is the oldest trick in the book. It erases. It resets. It builds new empires on old bones. The 1933 fire didn't just kill men. It killed the truth. And from its smoke rose the illusion of paradise. Every wildfire you see today, every hill glowing like a furnace, ask yourself, is this nature? Or is it negotiation? Is it tragedy? Or is it business? Because in this city, nothing burns without a reason. And sometimes, the most powerful flames start with a signature. Griffith Park, a jewel of Los Angeles, forged in fire, built on secrets, and the dark truth that never dies. Because the real inferno isn't in the hills, it's in the hearts of men.